Chapter 10, Access Control Solutions for Remote Workers. Learning objectives and key concepts. Learning objectives. Implement a secure remote access solution. Key concepts. Remote access solutions. Remote access protocols with their respective applications, virtual private networks, secure web authentication, and best practices for remote access control. Growth in mobile workforce. Factors to consider when planning a remote access environment. Do remote workers need access from various locations such as hospitals, airports, customer sites, coffee shops, and so on? Will network access be granted only to employer-owned computer resources, or will employees be allowed to access using personal, customer-owned, or publicly available resources as well? Will every employee be allowed to have a laptop for remote access? How will the data on the laptop be protected if lost or stolen? Do employees need to use mobile phones, smartphones, and tablets? Do they need to access the organization's network with these devices? How will remote employees access organization resources? Will virtual private networks access be required, or web access to the organization resources be sufficient? What level of authentication will be required for remote access? Remote access methods and techniques. Remote access means enabling remote employees are able to work as if work in the office. Challenges. Remote worker data is not shared. The correct person is gaining access. The correct access is being provided. Solution. Implementing identification, authentication, and authorization for remote access. Remote access methods and techniques. Identification, the process of uniquely distinguishing an individual. Common forms of identification include names or account numbers. Identification may refer to a person's program, system, or program. In the network environment, a username is your unique identification. Authentication, the process of verifying that users are who they say they are. All forms of authentication are based on something you have, something you are, or something you know. Remote access authentication may include multi-factors authentication. Authorization, determine what actions are allowed or not allowed by the users or systems. Occurs after authentication is completed, provides a secondary layer of security, network, and network data. Access protocol to minimize risk. Authentication, authorization, and accounting. Remote authentication dials in users' services, radius. Remote access server, RAS. Terminal access control systems, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Network services that provide security through a framework of access controls and policies, enforcements and policies, information needed for billing purposes. Framework that multiplies are based on. Remote access dial-in service, radius, a client or server protocol that provides authentication and authorization for remote users, also providing accounting capabilities. A network protocol providing communication between a network access server and an authentication server. Radius infrastructure, you can see. Client-server model enables application services to be spread across multiple systems. Client sends a request to service. Client includes the user interface and communication mechanisms to request service. Server handles the data processing service requested by the client. Remote access server. Remote authentication for remote access is an internet and dial-up scenario. User connects to the RAS. Credentials are compared against the database. If credentials match, authentication has occurred, and user granted access to the network. The TACACS, Terminal Access Control System, Cisco proprietary protocol that provides access controls for routers, networks, access servers, and other network devices. Combines authentication and authorization over TCP/ICP networks. An extension of that separates authentication, authorization, and accounting. Terminal access control systems plus utilize TCP, ensuring that delivery of the message differs from the terminal access control by separating the authentication, authorization, and accounting architects are allowed for additional methods of authentication, encrypts communications, AAA to retrieve, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Remote access. Password authentication protocol. Data link protocol that provides authentication over PPP. Point-to-point allows the internet connection to occur over a phone line. Challenge handshake authentication protocol provides authentication over PPP. Network authentication protocols. 802.1x protocol provides a framework for implementing authentication on networks. Roles. Supplicant, the software running on a client that wishes to connect to the network. Authenticator, the network device that the client wishes to connect to, typically an Ethernet switch or wireless access point. Authentication server, the server that validates requests for network access using a radius or an EIP. Extensive authentication protocol, EAP, a framework that enables multiple authentication mechanisms over a wireless network or PPP connection. EAP over radius, and you can see EAP client over the radius client to the radius server. Process of EAP message encapsulation in wireless LAN using the 802 standard. Virtual private networks. VPNs are a way for remote access employees to gain secure access to corporate networks. A VPN establishes a private network over a public network, such as an internet, using the internet connection that the system has already established. Security over VPN is provided through encryption. Tunneling protocol. Transport layer security, the modern standard of VPNs. Point-to-point tunneling allows PPP to be tunneled over the IP network. Layer 2 tunneling protocol provides the same functionality as PPP but on networks other than IP networks. Internet Protocol Security provides a method for establishing a security channel. Web authentication, ensuring users who they are, user ID and password is a basic form of authentication. Other forms of authentication, one-time password authentication, or digital certificates. Knowledge-based authentication. Knowledge-based is the identification of a web authentication mechanism used in real life as questions and answer processes. Questions and answers are obtained from public records or private data warehouse firms. Example, what is the model of your first car? Questions are used to prove that who you are, say you are. Authentication of a user, they establish their challenge response questions. Challenge response questions are sent by the user. Best practices for remote access to support remote workers. Determine the security risk associated with remote access. Select the remote access option and addresses the security need. Determine the appropriate level of authentication based on security risk. Ensure the systems that are accessing the network meet the security policies and organizations. Ensure protection of the systems that a remote worker accesses. Case study, private sector, Miller Corporation, a small organization with 5 sales reps. Remote access for sales reps was cumbersome, converted to VPN for remote users. Public sector, major city government needed to ensure its departments were complying with appropriate remote access security policies and regulatory requirements. Employed security and auditing through IAAA framework. Critical infrastructure. Gas distribution companies needed to implement secure dial-in infrastructure for a group of financial employees, wanted to ensure AAA implemented TACA. Some are remote access solutions, remote access protocols and their respective applications, but virtual private networks, secure authentication, and best practices.